James Bond.
Approaching the mid-90s, James Bond found himself somewhat stretched.
Hold it, right there.
It had been approximately 10 years since there was a truly successful Bond film.
I'd rather not talk about it.
There is this feeling of like, are the Bond films beginning to get a little bit clunkier?
The Living Daylights had scared the living daylights out of MGM UA, and License to Kill had failed to do just that at the box office.
There was a huge question mark over whether we would even make a James Bond movie.
The studio wasn't the only one questioning Bond.
Am I going to win or lose?
The Wall Street Journal said on the front page, is there still a market for a James Bond film in the post-Cold War period? Maybe, but we wouldn't gamble tens of millions of dollars to find out.
Bond always loved to gamble, but now the chips were down at MGM.
We had a very tight budget.
It's just one financial crisis after another.
Before he could save the world again, someone needed to save the studio.
And I said, there's blood on the carpet. Good. That's how it ought to be.
By 1990, MGM UA, Bond's spiritual home since the 70s, was struggling. The future of the franchise now depended on a character who could easily have strolled right out of a Bond story.
An Italian financier called Giancarlo Peretti.
Peretti bought MGM for $1.3 billion.
Peretti, in order to finance it, had promised the rights to Bond TV output to other parties at a knockdown rate, therefore negatively impacting Cubby Broccoli.
Giancarlo was playing hardball.
And Broccoli came back and said, no, you really can't.
Cubby had found a new Bond villain, and he was the owner of the studio.
Cubby Broccoli went into litigation with the MGM and ostensibly against Giancarlo Peretti's financial maneuvering.
They got into a lawsuit over the studio ownership, and ultimately they decided we're just gonna have to wait this out.
And Cubby Broccoli received a settlement in his favor.
The Bond rights were safe, but MGM was losing $1 million a day.
It took until the early 90s for them to get in a position where the studio was out from underneath all of this financial threat.
Peretti was many things straight out of Bond. A womanizer,
He was wanted in his native Italy.
a convicted felon.
In fact, Giancarlo Peretti ended up in jail.
One thing he was not was liquid. When he defaulted on his loan, French bank Credit Lyonnais acquired MGM.
A new conglomerate of investors had come in and pumped MGM back up.
The bank gave the studio clear instructions to get their house in order.
They bring in new blood.
Frank Mancuso took over MGM UA and John Calley came in.
Is a famous Hollywood executive.
Also new was a young executive named Jeff Kleeman, who found his job description just got awfully serious.
The mandate was essentially we had to build MGM UA up as well and as quickly as we could so that when the deadline came for Credit Lyonnais to sell it, they could sell it for a good price, which meant that we had a ticking clock of only a few years. And it was another reason why initially Frank Mancuso wasn't sure that he wanted to put his resources towards a Bond movie, which at the time seemed far from a sure thing.
Even if Bond did get to save the world again, there was a small complication on that front too.
The world had changed politically in the time between License to Kill and GoldenEye.
Since Bond had last strutted the silver screen, the Cold War had ended, leaving James Bond villainless.
The Soviet Empire had collapsed.
So the question is, this entire Cold War motif that Bond had existed under, what do you do with that? Where do you go with that? Who is James Bond out there fighting now?
A lot of people questioned, was Bond relevant in the 1990s.
This was arguably the most serious threat to Bond, and there was one other small matter to address.
Who should be James Bond in the 1990s? It had been a number of years had passed since we'd last seen Timothy Dalton in Licence to Kill.
The question was, do we continue with Timothy Dalton or do we find a new actor?
The Broccoli's were not yet done with Timothy Dalton, but before they could even think about a new 007, MGM received field intelligence that set off alarm bells about the entire franchise.
Frank Mancuso ordered a major researcher group in Los Angeles to go out and find out what the audience interest in a new Bond movie would be. And they came back with very dire news.
MGM HQ had discovered a problem that even 007 was going to find hard to fix.
The key market for most big, expensive, spectacle, action-based movies is young males. And it turned out that there were essentially no teenage boys in America who knew who James Bond was.
I got the message.
Which is sort of the kiss of death if you're trying to sell a movie to teenage boys.
You know, is this really the right time for Bond?
So the attitude at MGM UA was, the audience has aged out. It's just been too long.
But it wasn't just the audience that had aged. Bond's style of action was starting to get old, too.
Action movies had changed.
The competition in action filmmaking at that time is ramping higher and higher.
Cameron and Spielberg and Zemeckis and others had really changed the way action movies looked and felt and were made.
You have action stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone as the biggest box office draws. These are the kings of the kingdom.
And in a sense, James Bond was now old-fashioned.
Fleming's Bond, once the epitome of cool, was looking pale, male, and stale. But one thing MGM had that was fresh was a script.
So Michael France writes a new draft.
An updated version of his story called GoldenEye.
We looked at the script that had been developed, and frankly, we were disappointed.
What's the matter, James? No glib remark? No pithy comeback?
It wasn't everything we wanted or hoped it would be, especially if it was going to relaunch the franchise and bring in a whole new audience. And also convince Frank Mancuso to greenlight a Bond film.
With no time to spare, the Broccoli set for a new writer and found this one.
I came into this through Barbara Broccoli.
Jeffrey Kane was given a clear mission brief.
Barbara's instruction was, change it any way you want, just make it work. Because at the moment, MGM doesn't feel it works, and neither do we.
Thankfully, Jeffrey only had one condition.
So I said to Barbara, I don't go away for long without my wife being there. And she said, oh, well, you know, most of my writers, they want cocaine and whores. You want chocolate bars and your wife. So they sent for her.
Jeffrey definitely needed his wife's support.
And she made some very useful suggestions.
As he rebuilt Michael France's script from the ground up.
Michael France removed a lot of the things that gave James Bond its individual stamp, its signature. He removed Q. So I had to put back in Q.
Need I remind you, 007, that you have a license to kill, not to break the traffic laws.
Moneypenny had gone, same as Q had gone. There were too many quintessential Bond elements missing from Michael's script, so I put them back in.
Good evening, Moneypenny.
It's the comfort of familiarity that's made the Bond franchise successful.
But Jeffrey would also add to that success.
In fact, most of the main characters were of my invention. Ourumov, the renegade Russian general. A woman villain who was sexy and dangerous.
I can't breathe!
For the most part, it was a classic Bond story.
James Bond fights against a rogue MI6 agent who aims to use a satellite weapon to cause a global financial meltdown.
And just because the Cold War was over, didn't mean Bond couldn't play with the Soviet-era toys left behind.
In escaping from the Russians, I wanted Bond to climb into a tank. All the controls would be marked in Russian, but that wouldn't bother him. And he turns right and goes through the nearest building. That was, to me, a funny moment.
Jeffrey was rehabilitating Bond one scene at a time, but the 17th Bond film was still missing one crucial element: Bond himself. Even before the Broccoli's considered replacing Timothy Dalton as Bond, MGM executives were entertaining options, and some of their options were entertaining.
At the time, one of the people who sort of kept coming up to us was Mel Gibson.
Do you wanna? Well, then that's fine with me.
But no Bond had ever started life as an established movie star, and with good reason.
They start out very expensive. So again, in success, if you're gonna make 2 movies, 3 movies, 4 movies, 5 movies with them, how astronomical is that cost going to become?
The search for Bond went on.
We had conversations with Liam Neeson.
But Liam had marital problems.
Liam Neeson has since gone on the record to say that his fiancée said that she wouldn't marry him if he took on the role of James Bond.
The studio saw a possible future.
We had conversations with Pierce Brosnan.
In a name from the past.
We knew that Pierce had been considered for Bond pre-Dalton. And in fact, that Cubby had liked Pierce for Bond. He actually felt like he was more appropriate for Bond now than he might have been back when he was doing Remington Steele, because he had a little more gravitas to him.
Years from now, when you talk of this, and you will, be kind.
Oh, he's an asshole, yeah. He was rude. I said something to him and he walked away.
Well, be that as it may, it was now a new battle of the Bonds. Would they go with a brand new Pierce Brosnan Bond, or stick with the somewhat successful Timothy Dalton Bond?
They talked about Timothy, and we talked about Pierce. We'd made our case for Pierce. Barbara and Michael primarily had made the case for Timothy. And then there was just silence. We were all sitting in John's office, and it was just silent.
Until, brooding like a Bond villain himself, Cubby broke the deadlock.
Cubby had a walking stick, and I remember him just tapping his walking stick on the floor. And we all turn, and he says, "Pierce it is."
And so, the man tasked with relaunching the 007 character for the 90s,
James Bond,
was actually more of an 80s guy?
He was a TV actor who was now playing second fiddle to Robin Williams and Mrs. Doubtfire.
Miranda's been raving about you.
Odd, she's never mentioned you.
No?
No.
Well,
What he was not seen as at that moment was a big movie star. So there was a little bit of fear within some of the corridors of MGM.
At least the project was being headed by a legendary producer.
Sadly, Cubby became increasingly absent due to health problems.
It was time for a changing of the guard.
Cubby was still involved, but Michael and Barbara were the chief people running the show on a daily basis.
Not only are they having to step up to produce this movie, but they're having to do so while their father is dying.
While their father was ailing, Barbara and Michael began to look for their director. A cheap one, hopefully.
MGM by this time had financial woes and they couldn't afford an A-list director. Eventually they land upon Martin Campbell.
The knock against Martin was that he made ultimately 3 movies prior to GoldenEye, and none of them performed at the box office.
Martin was going to need to really nail his job interview.
When I went into the meeting, they said, well, what did you think of the last Bond film? And I said, well, I didn't like it very much. You know, I should have shut up, actually.
Instead, Martin had a question of his own for MGM head Frank Mancuso.
And I said, why me? One, he said, I saw No Escape and I really liked it. And I assumed the other was I was probably cheap.
And he took the job.
So at this point, we had a TV actor to star as Bond, and we had a feature director who had never directed a commercially successful feature.
So, MGM naturally greenlit. Nothing. After all, the script wasn't even done.
Cubby said, how are the meetings going? We're having meetings every day to talk about the story and the script. And I said, there's blood on the carpet. And he said, good. That's how it ought to be during meetings, blood on the carpet.
Unfortunately for Jeffrey, there was more blood to come after he handed in his draft and received a call from Barbara.
She called me and said, I've got good news and I've got bad news. I said, don't tell me. The good news is you all love the script, the bad news is you want to put somebody else on it. And she said, yes. And I said, well, why? Oh, it needed more jokes.
Did you check her out? Head to toe.
He did the script, you know, it just wasn't there.
A new writer would be drafted, but in the meantime, the movie was greenlit based on Jeffrey's script.
The budget we were greenlit on GoldenEye was $49 million.
Shortly thereafter, a punch-up ensued.
Bruce Fierstein came in.
And the idea was that Bruce was essentially going to punch up some dialogue. And Bruce ended up doing a lot more than that.
I think he went over every scene in terms of dialogue, the humor, which Bruce is excellent at doing.
Bruce was most famous for having written a book called Real Men Don't Eat Quiche.
In fact, he was a master of satire, whose take on masculinity posed some serious questions about the nature of Bond.
Who is James Bond now?
Oh, grow up, 007.
I think that the best summation of that was a very slender statement by Bruce Fierstein, which was just this: the world has changed, James Bond has not.
To Bruce, it was as clear as a vodka martini.
Shaken, not stirred.
While he was a hard-living, hard-drinking, hard-womanizing secret agent, the world around him had changed.
And really, it was about how does James Bond respond to that world.
Bond needed rehab, and the martinis weren't the issue.
They felt that it was time to update Bond in some way.
The question was how to modernize 007 without interfering with his very DNA.
I have no problem with female authority.
Really, for Barbara and Michael, it was always this balancing act of how do they respect what their father had built while moving it forward.
The answer was not to change Bond, but to change everything around him, from the top down.
On the top?
On the top.
Bruce Fierstein encouraged Martin Campbell to make M a woman.
That was me, actually. What I felt was it was very important to sort of bring it up to date and to put a woman in the role.
This was more than just progressive hiring practices at MI6.
You were saying?
Actually, it was more to do with what M was saying.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur.
Suddenly, Bond's own franchise was calling him out.
He's admonished and challenged by a newly empowered female.
But it wouldn't be just any empowered female.
It was John Kelly who said to me, look, if you're going to get a woman, get someone who's bloody good. He said, how about Judi Dench?
When Judi Dench was first cast as M, she wasn't what we would call a movie star. She was, reasonably big on British TV. She was very excited by the prospect of appearing in the Bond films.
So were executives.
We were going to have this acerbic woman who was going to call Bond out on his behavior as the new M. It was huge.
I want you to find GoldenEye.
We were all terrified, but we all got it. And we said, go for it.
In one fell swoop, the Bond franchise had triumphantly entered the 90s.
It was very important to them to retain their vision of Cubby's legacy of Bond.
But part of that legacy included Bond girls that also needed to evolve.
You know, this sort of behavior could qualify as sexual harassment.
We wanted more than just beautiful. Beautiful isn't that hard to come by in Hollywood.
The question was, how? GoldenEye had a semi-reformed 007 in an updated Bond. But James was missing something. A foe, and a female one.
We really wanted somebody who had a lot of other qualities and a lot of other stuff going on with her.
That was true of the bad girls and the good. Diverse qualities like this unique ability.
Xenia Onatop, the woman that killed men by making love to them and then breaking their back in the process.
Xenia Onatop represents a return of women villains to the Bond franchise.
The casting of Famke Janssen was a fantastic one.
She wasn't going to make Xenia just a cardboard henchwoman.
You think I've gone to heaven?
Not yet.
And so, with the villain cast, they were almost ready to go.
We'd got everybody except we didn't have the girl.
A 90s Bond girl for a 90s Bond.
And obviously the pressure was on because we were shooting in 6 days or something, and we had no lead actress.
The casting director, Debbie McWilliams, had been looking all over Russia and Yugoslavia.
And she gets to Sweden, she calls and says, I've got the girl.
Welcome to the party, my dear.
Isabella was dumped on a plane literally the next morning, sent. She read for 30 seconds.
Who's that? Natalia Simonova.
Immediately, once she read, we all knew that she was going to bring something different from previous Bond girls.
She looked terrific, and her reading was terrific, and I gave her a job.
This new generation of women were creating a Bond Girl 2.0.
That's something that is a unique development of the necessity and the balance that seems to come in the 1990s.
But that wasn't the only first. GoldenEye would be the first film to lead Ian Fleming's stories completely behind.
The point was it had to be an original story. This wasn't from a book, of which, by the way, there are very few. Most people think there are a ton of books that are not.
The story and nearly everything about GoldenEye was new.
We were all first-timers, and we all felt the weight, not just making good for the audience, but also the pressure to prove ourselves to the studio.
Well, maybe they could throw money at the problem.
We had a very tight budget.
Or not.
To make this movie.
To realize his film's big ambitions would require playing with some small toys.
The jet planes taking off were actually models.
But there was another way to save money. A new gadget was now available, one more powerful than anything Q could offer.
We were very aware that action is now being done, particularly with the influx of CGI and green screens, in a very different way from Bond.
It seemed that Bruce Fierstein's wisdom
The world has changed. James Bond has not.
was relevant to this topic as well.
We wanted to have as little CGI, as little green screen as possible.
And to show Bond could still do stunts like no one else, Martin had a singular idea.
Martin, coming at it from a director's point of view, said, and I want to do the first big stunt in a single shot. I want to essentially lay down the gauntlet for the audience right at the beginning.
The gauntlet looked like this.
And said to Barbara and Michael, what say we do a bungee jump off this, right?
It was a stunt that would make a statement.
Saying, this is a movie where the action is taking a completely different approach from all those other CGI movies you're seeing right now.
So different that finding a real dam was quite a bit harder than programming one on a computer.
The problem was simply that most dams curve at the bottom. So, they curve outwards. So if you're going to make a bungee jump, the stuntman's going to hit his head.
But once the location was found...
And it was the only dam we could find that literally had a vertical wall.
All 660 feet of it in Switzerland.
We could do it for real, so it doesn't look like it's been cheated.
Doing it for real would be the job of stuntman Wayne Michaels.
And when he was standing up there, about to jump off the dam, he said he looked out of his left eye and he said he saw this little Italian crane driver do the sign of the crucifix before he jumped off. And he said, what the hell have I just agreed to do?
Well, he agreed to do this.
The opening shot of GoldenEye is one of the great James Bond stunts.
This one even broke a record.
And the bungee jump is the highest bungee jump ever done in a movie, which made the Guinness Book of Records.
Not all of the stunts on the GoldenEye shoot were actually in the script.
Another key action sequence in the movie is the tank chase in St. Petersburg.
Well, that was in the script, but what happened next wasn't on anybody's radar.
We wanted Bond to go to Russia.
The Bond producers got permission to actually shoot in the city of St. Petersburg.
We had all of our permits, we had the mayor on board.
But Eon Productions were not the only ones primed to shoot.
And we started shooting the tank chase. The film crew, the whole production group showed up to the set, to the location. And the St. Petersburg militia was ringed around the set. And they explained that they had orders to shoot if anybody started filming.
At the time, there was a lot of illegal business going on.
At which point, we then saw our security all get into their cars and leave.
Producers sent their fixers straight to the mayor, waving GoldenEye's permits.
And the mayor said, yes, you have the permits. Now that I understand the extent, it's going to cost a lot more. And the fixer said, what do you have in mind? And the mayor said, $3 million.
The situation was straight out of a Bond film. But producers decided, not this Bond film.
We didn't trust it. We thought this could happen over and over and over again.
So I talked to my production designer, Peter Lamont, and he said, no problem. He said, I'll build it. I'll build you St. Petersburg.
So someone on the Broccoli team came up with the idea of taking this abandoned Rolls-Royce factory on the outskirts of London and turn it into a studio. It was our only and best option.
And Leavesden would provide more than just sound stages.
Because it had been used to manufacture airplanes, it had all this space.
It had so much outdoor space. This was where Peter Lamont, the production designer, was able to rebuild St. Petersburg on the backlots.
And what we did was get a lot of old T-34 Russian tanks over to Leavesden. I think they cost £15,000 each. I think we had 5 or 6. And Peter built the rest of the roundabouts, the streets, the tank going through the narrow alley, coming out the brick wall. There he is sitting in a tank, the whole bloody place has collapsed on his head. And, you know, he just instinctively sort of straightens his tie. That was my idea. You know, you can't resist those moments.
But as they raced to the finish line, time would tell if GoldenEye was going to
tank.
To make a real song and dance about the first Bond film of the 90s, producers needed a song and dance.
GoldenEye, I found his weakness.
One of the most exciting things about the James Bond rollout is who is going to sing the title song.
GoldenEye's theme tune had a direct line back to Bond's creator.
The story of the theme song of GoldenEye is the story of Ian Fleming. I mean, Ian Fleming built this house in Jamaica called GoldenEye.
So, GoldenEye exists.
Owned by a music producer, GoldenEye now existed as a kind of musical hangout spot.
U2 and Bono were staying at Ian Fleming's home of GoldenEye, and they were sitting at GoldenEye and they came up with this theme.
The theme to GoldenEye.
Who better than Bono and the Edge to actually write the song?
Write it? Definitely. Sing it? Well... Bono found a better singer over his back fence.
Bono went round to see Tina Turner. They were neighbours, and he left her with the demo, but he said it's a terrible demo. But as soon as she put her voice to it, boy, you had a classic James Bond title song.
That was the song. But what about the dance?
Maurice Binder, who designed the sequences to many of the early Bond films, had passed away during the 6-year hiatus.
GoldenEye needed a new choreographer for his iconic opening.
My name's Daniel Kleinman. I direct the title sequence for James Bond films.
Daniel had already impressed the Broccoli's by directing the music video for License to Kill.
I think my favourite title sequence of all time is probably You Only Live Twice. The Japanese graphics and the beauty of the colours and the way it kind of connected to the story and the exoticism, that's really fantastic.
Just as the three-dimensional Bond girls were now different, Daniel wanted to bring the dancing Bond women into the 90s.
What I did want to do was to change the title sequence from being just a kind of list of names and random images to being something which was more connected to the narrative of the story. It represented a passage of time, and that time is the time when the Soviet Union crumbles. I represented that by the ladies smashing the Soviet statues to pieces.
More permanent than Soviet statues were elements of Bond that were now part of the furniture, like the theme tune. No one would dare take the axe to that.
In keeping with wanting to give GoldenEye a contemporary feel, but at the same time, staying pure to Bond.
Producers asked for a refresh from French composer Eric Serra, who had impressed with his work on Leon.
And I thought, who could be better to rejuvenate the whole series than someone like him?
We thought it would be interesting to bring in somebody like Eric, who had a unique style of composition.
Executives discovered just how unique Eric's style was when he turned in his score.
The Bond theme was completely missing.
He hadn't missed the Bond theme, he had dumped it completely.
So I rang the composer and said, we have a real problem here. And I explained what the problem was, and his answer was, turn down the effects, right? So I basically hung up on him. I've never talked to him since.
And Martin quickly spoke to someone else.
Hi there, my name's John Altman. Initially, I had done Leon with Eric Serra, and I went with him as his arranger and conductor, and matters came to a head. They telephoned me and
I said, you're going to have to compose all the music for the tank chase. I'm throwing out what I've got.
When I became the composer of the tank chase, I was starting from scratch. I basically knew they wanted big brass and, big percussion, and knew that they wanted the Bond theme at certain points.
I said I want a lot of Bond theme.
Particularly with GoldenEye, you've got, tank bursting through the wall. Tank hitting the statue and the statue landing on top of the tank. I think it's crucial.
Also crucial was the schedule.
I saw the sequence on Friday. I composed the tank chase on Saturday. I orchestrated it on Sunday. It was copied on Monday, and we recorded it on Tuesday.
He came back with the music on Tuesday, and we scored with his music, and it's terrific.
So in less than a week, we had the whole thing done. I think somebody said you saved our movie.
After 6 years in the wilderness, Bond was back. Or was he?
Nobody knew how the world was going to respond to the return of 007.
GoldenEye was ready to relaunch Bond for the 90s. But would anyone care? Actually, on November 17, 1995...
GoldenEye was a hit. GoldenEye brought Bond back. Audiences were ready for it. The critics were ready for it.
And so were MGM UA's coffers.
GoldenEye blasted Bond box office records with an incredible $350 million from around the world. James Bond was finally back.
This relic of the Cold War was hot all over again.
For England, James? No.
All of a sudden, teenagers thought Bond was cool again.
Even though GoldenEye had, for many fans, committed a grievous act of blasphemy.
The BMW Z3.
Or to put it another way,
one of the greatest product placement deals of the 1990s in Hollywood.
BMW, agile 5 forward gears, all points radar.
A lot of Bond fans were very vocal about not being okay with Bond's Aston Martin being replaced by a BMW.
It was just there because they'd been paid to put it there, but it didn't do anything. Product placement isn't one of my favorite things.
Thankfully,
we barely see the car in the film.
But that didn't appease the OG fans, as outrage reverberated all the way up to the very height of British power. Okay, not the Queen, not even MI6, but certainly Westminster.
Questions were asked in the House of Commons. Why is Bond driving a German car and not a British car?
Actually, Bond still got to drive his Aston Martin in GoldenEye as a kind of swerving swan song in the original DB5.
I enjoy a spirited ride as much as the next girl,
But BMW was now paying his bills.
They contributed so much to the movie, so much budget. It allowed them to go a lot further than what Aston Martin was going to allow them to do.
Bond's new teenage audience didn't care what or how 007 drove. They were interested in something much more animated than a Bond car chase.
Nobody knew just how crucial this GoldenEye video game that they approved would turn out to be. They loved the video game, and so they wanted to see the movie and vice versa. So it was great cross-marketing.
Bond had a side hustle for the digital age.
The GoldenEye video game immediately tapped into the teenage boy video game market, and it became this massive success. It creates a franchise of Bond video games that is sold millions and millions.
And it had been made possible by his daughter and stepson.
The Broccoli's did a wonderful job of keeping that franchise going. They bent with the wind instead of breaking. When times changed and tastes changed, they changed with them.
And Cubby got to savor the fruits of those endeavors as he watched the last Bond film he would ever see.
Cubby Broccoli was very ill, and Broccoli passed away at his home in June 1996, but at least he got to see GoldenEye become a success. He saw Barbara and Michael safely take control, safely take the baton and run with it.
It was the end of an era. Besides Ian Fleming, no one individual has defined Bond more completely than Cubby Broccoli.
It was very touching, very, very sad. Sad day to say goodbye to such a lovely man.
He was such a friendly, gregarious, and loving guy. I mean, he was so different than the James Bond mystique.
A titan of Hollywood whose work spans generations, Cubby is remembered as much for his presence as the presence of his movies.
You know, he was lovely, charming, very understated, warm, lovely man.
He was somebody who won you over just by the sheer force of friendliness in his personality.
Of all of Cubby's many savvy decisions, over more than 30 years of Bond, his greatest might just have been his last.
The great thing that Cubby did is put Barbara in charge, you know. She learned from the best and became a really great producer. As a woman, she's, one of the first really big-time producers.
Cubby would be so proud of her. He would be so proud because she's still flying the flag, basically, and carrying on his mantle.
Cubby's death marked the end of an era, but the Broccoli name was still on the marquee with Barbara and Michael, ushering in a new era because, for the very first time, Cubby's daughter brought to Bond one thing her father never could: a female perspective. If it's true that
the world has changed, James Bond has not.
Then Barbara Broccoli made sure that the world around Bond kept up with the 90s.
Madame wins.
One of the reasons why I believe women of the 1990s in the Brosnan era are so strong is because of Barbara Broccoli helming this franchise.
On Barbara's watch, female characters had grown in stature because Barbara felt they needed a home.
Every woman in Bond's world has to belong.
And for some, belonging to the Bond firm even meant making partner.
So someone like Natalia Simonova in GoldenEye, she's the brains. She's a computer programmer. Bond is the brawn.
I was a systems programmer at Severnaya facility until...
The two of them form a true partnership, and they need each other in order to achieve the mission.
They're going to kill me, aren't they?
Before GoldenEye changed the script,
trust me,
the position of women in Bond films was often, well, horizontal.
especially the 70s and the 80s, they really do get relegated into the role of damsel in distress.
During that period of time, women are supposed to be submissive. By the 90s, if women were submitting, it was now on our terms.
The Brosnan-era films, in my opinion, have the strongest representation of empowered women.
And you had the ultimate Bond woman in Dame Judi Dench. It's definitely evolved.
They have evolved. I think they have become more proactive. They've become fiercer.
They're not as much, being lovey-dovey and, as sexual.
From the days of Dr. No's Ladies in Waiting to Tomorrow Never Dies.
Wei Lin, I'm from the New China News Agency.
Finally, the first Chinese Bond girl arrived in 1997, and she meant business.
Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies is definitely Bond's equal.
She's not only equal to James Bond, she's arguably superior. She's known for doing her own stunts as well.
In a way, James Bond was now surrounded by Jane Bonds.
And so these women are true partners to Bond.
They can have his back and fight too.
In other words, he really can't complete the mission without them.
Rather than a submissive woman always getting laid by Bond. But there's still a time and place for that. And not simply on Bond's terms.
Marley Warmflash was actually using James Bond. I felt as though it was a very powerful female role. Small, but powerful.
Having a powerful woman in the producer's chair was a breath of fresh air behind the scenes, too.
Barbara Broccoli is one of the funniest people I've ever met. And so there was a shot of my derriere. So one of my outfits was this underwear set. And while we were trying it on, she said, Serena, really, I'm going to change your name to Serena Scott Bottom. And that's what she called me.
Come the World Is Not Enough? Barbara's Bond women had grown powerful enough to be truly evil.
Who is that young woman? King's daughter, Electra.
She's the first woman arch-villain in a film.
5 more turns and your neck will break.
There's no question who wore the pants here.
I've always had a power over men.
Finally, Bond women could spread their wings.
Jinx is Bond's equal.
Not Jinx anymore?
Oh, I'll always be a jinx to you.
But Pierce Brosnan was no jinx. His films were the highest-grossing Bond movies yet. And when it came time to move on from the fifth Bond,
00 status rescinded.
the Broccoli's decided to press rewind.
We want to go back to Bond's origins. We want to go back to the first James Bond novel. Dust off your copies of Casino Royale.
Not just back to the first Bond story.
The whole point was to reboot the whole series.
Back to a time before Bond was even Bond.
Casino clearly is a prequel because he hasn't become the James Bond we know.
And the last time we saw Casino Royale on screen back in 1967, it was absolutely nothing like the Bond we know.
Peter Sellers is James Bond.
Casino Royale was a madcap comedy.
Daniel Craig's Casino Royale would be no comedy.
And now Barbara and Michael are truly on their own, and they want to take this franchise out for a spin, creatively as well as financially.
If it didn't unmake a franchise.
They're really taking over every aspect of the production and writing in a new way and trying something new. It's their careers and their lives on the line as well, because this is their whole life.